This lecture will review a broad overview of the qualitative research approach in the social sciences and focus specifically on the interview and participant observation methods. Okay, so as a recap to what we have talked about throughout the semester and as covered in the Reagan and Amoroso textbook, the qualitative and quantitative approach can be broadly understood as separate from one another as different research methods. And so this is the way a researcher plans out to collect data and observations to then make sense of their research topic in question, where qualitative research approaches are interested in collecting data and observations that cannot be easily converted into numeric form, as well as collecting information that includes a lot more details and nuance. So the example here of a 3-hour interview with 20 parents, and this could be about any topic, is a good one because we can see how over the course of 3 hours, there's going to be a lot of details shared, a lot of examples, and the researcher and participant are able to create a lot of information out about a particular topic or issue or problem, whereas a survey question, which we just finished reviewing, is going to be standardized and have set answers, right? So there's not really room for nuance or variation. Everything is standardized and in the same order, right? So the quantitative research approach that we just finished up reviewing is interested in collecting data that's already in or can be easily converted to numeric form, right? So like age, income, using the Likert scale to collect data on opinions or attitudes, whereas a qualitative is interested in much more depth and detail and nuance. Here's another way for us to visualize and think about the kinds of decisions that would go into deciding whether or not to take a qualitative approach over a quantitative approach. So we talked about this a little bit in our last class meeting before the spring break and before going online, that one of the reasons why you would be interested in selecting a quantitative research approach is if you are in need of collecting data on a significant sample of the population, right? So if you're interested in food security, sticking with our theme of food, you want to get a lot of data on a lot of people, right? Whether it's across the state of Hawaii, whether it's looking at a particular island and comparing islands to one another, or even across the entire United States. And the most effective and efficient way to collect that data quickly and in a standardized, systematic way is with a survey, right? And so you can see with this typology how as the number of cases increase, right? So if you have many cases but not too many variables because you're really just looking for a handful of things. So in this example of food security or food insecurity, you're interested in some demographic variables, and then maybe a few questions about, how much money can you spend on food per month? What kinds of access do you have to fresh produce, things like that, and how regularly it's disrupted? You're not going to have too many variables, right? And so you're going to be leaning more towards the quantitative approach. However, if you're interested in collecting a lot of information with a smaller group of people, and again, we can still think about food security and insecurity, an interview method is more appropriate. And we can see on this typology how the number of cases, so that's the number of participants when we're doing research with human subjects, or if you're doing kind of a more content analysis type of approach, that would be, the actual content that you're analyzing. So the number of cases and the number of variables are very much related to a decision about whether or not you would take a more qualitative versus a quantitative approach. Another way to visualize this chart that is up here on the slide is that in the Reagan and Amoroso text on page 46, so this is back in chapter 2, but figure 2.1 has a really nice chart, and it's just a different way to visualize the kinds of factors that go into deciding whether to take a qualitative versus a quantitative research approach. Okay, so here are some of the most common qualitative methods that you will find within the qualitative research approach in the social sciences. So the first one is we can broadly understand as social observation, and within that method, there's participant and non-participant. So non-participant social observation is more kind of that the researcher is not really embedding themselves. They're kind of just showing up, say maybe to a classroom and doing a series of observations across different classrooms. They may be interested in comparing different schools, different teachers, different grades, different methods, things of that nature, right? But they're not actively participating in it, and essentially they're trying to take more of a fly on the wall type of approach, right? Whereas an ethnography, which we can consider to be an example of participant observation, the researcher is embedding themselves in that particular site. So I'm going to talk more extensively about that type of method a little bit later. But also I just want to move on and kind of review quickly. So interview method is the other method I'm going to be focusing on in this lecture. And there are different types of interviews that I will discuss in a moment, but also one way we can understand how interviews can vary is there typically is a one-on-one type of setting where there's a participant and the researcher, but then there are also focus group interviews that take place. So this generally is a usually a smaller type of group, maybe 10 people, maybe less, sometimes more, but usually about 8 to 10 people is kind of considered an ideal size. And there may be one researcher or a few researchers that are there and facilitate a discussion around a particular topic, a particular issue, maybe a series of issues. And this definitely changes the dynamic, as you can imagine, having others present in terms of kinds of the ways that the conversation will unfold, right? But both of those are considered part of the interview method. Then there's also comparative research and case studies, and this is where a researcher is taking a really in-depth look at a particular case. And so we can understand a case to be something like a country, it could be a state, it could be legislation, things of that nature where there are a lot of sources of data and a lot of information to collect and compare, usually across time or also across space. So we can think of that in terms of nations or societies, right? Cross-cultural type of research and comparative research. Content analysis is where a researcher is collecting data and observations that are not from a human participant. It comes from content, and this could be anything from tweets on Twitter to activity on other social media platforms such as Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. It could also be things like magazine, newspapers, a video series, advertisements, things of that nature. There's also a really great archive that we were going to tour, and unfortunately we're not able to this semester, but I hope you're able to in later semesters and future semesters. The Ulu Ulu archive that is housed in the library at West Oahu is a great place where students could conduct a content analysis based on the materials that they have there, which are all in visual format. So there's home videos, there's commercials, and the kind of the unifying theme of the collection in the archive is that it's anything and everything related to the state of Hawaii. So it's a really interesting place, and that would be an example of a way that you could conduct content analysis. And so that leads in well to the last point, historical and archival methods, which rely on content analysis. Typically, you're not going to be able to interview participants when you're doing historical research. The further back in time it is, the harder it is to find participants. But it is certainly possible, but historical and archival methods are typically going to be utilizing the content method, the content analysis method. Okay, so the first of the two qualitative methods that I'm going to be reviewing is that of the qualitative interview. Next, I will review participant observation. So interviews can range from structured to open-ended. So essentially, what we need to know about these terms when we're talking about the interview method is that a structured interview, highly structured interview, in real life looks like the researcher has a list of questions and they ask all of their participants those questions, and no matter what the participant says, they will not deviate from that list of questions. So it just goes in that order, and for the most part, the questions are going to be open-ended, right? Whereas open-ended interviews are the researcher shows up, and this would definitely be more common in the focus group type of example, right? Where so perhaps you're interested in what are kind of the resources that parents are interested in learning more about. So you want to do a focus group with parents. And that's really kind of what you just show up with in terms of your question and topic. And you more or less let the participants kind of lead the discussion and the conversation, and you would then prompt them with follow-up questions, right? So that's what an open-ended type of interview would look like. So semi-structured interviews, however, are the ones that occupy the middle ground. And this is where you still have a list of questions, but what you do when you devise these questions is you anticipate the ways that your participants are going to respond differently, right? So you would have maybe several follow-up questions included, and so depending on what your participant says, you would then ask them that question, right? So the semi-structured interview occupies the middle ground, more or less, in this range of structured to open-ended interviews, and is the most common type of interview that social scientists utilize, right? So the other characteristic of the qualitative interview in the social sciences is that the questions are led by the researcher and the investigator. So even in the focus group setting, it's still going to be the researcher that is going to be keeping people on track, keeping people on point, helping people to stay focused on the particular topic and issue at hand, and providing those follow-up prompts and questions, right? And typically interviews are going to be in a one-on-one setting, like we see in the images here on the screen. So some of the challenges to the interview method, as all research methods have, they all have their own sets of challenges and limitations, is that the ordering of questions is extraordinarily important. So when we talked about surveys the last few weeks, we talked about the order of questions and the wording of questions and the question choices, and these are all things that matter in terms of creating and constructing good surveys. And even more so than the survey method, the order of the questions matter. So I'll give you an example. And so when we're thinking about the kinds of research topics that you may pursue in the future, whether it's in your senior project or in graduate school or in your professional life beyond this, it is highly advisable to not begin your interview just jumping right into questions that are asking a participant to share sensitive and revealing information about themselves, right? And this could be anything that could include drug use, alcohol use, history of abusive relationships or family dynamics, and this could include anything from verbal to mental to sexual to physical, right? And domestic violence is a part of that category. So these are all things that social scientists research, but they are also all experiences that can be deeply traumatic for participants, and it's really far more important in the interview setting than it is in a survey to develop what Robert Weiss, we're going to read an article of his next week, calls as a rapport, right? The interview and participant rapport. You need to build up a sense of trust. And so you don't start off interviews with these really personal questions. And even if your topic is not as sensitive as some of the ones that I just listed, you still don't really want to just start off with asking a deeply personal question of your participant, because you are still a stranger to them and they are most likely still a stranger to you. So this rapport between the investigator and participant is extraordinarily important. And you see in the top image that we see these two women talking, and just imagine they're having an interview for a social science project. And we can see that they look to be fairly equal to each other and very close in status, right? That we would consider them to be potentially in the same kind of peer group, right? The image on the lower part of the screen shows an adult and a child, right? And so this is also a really important way to highlight how the rapport between the investigator and the participant is extraordinarily important, right? Because in both of these settings, even though they are different in terms of the age discrepancy between the participant and the researcher still does hold a particular authority and power over the participant, and so this isn't always going to be an ethical consideration, right? So the ordering of your questions, establishing a rapport is one of the things that is incredibly challenging for interviewers to develop and master, right? So not all social scientists are going to be equally skilled at this particular method, right? So the last challenge that I want to review here is that the context and the contextual details of the interview are also significant, and they hold a lot more sway and influence over the actual interview and the quality of the interview than, say, a survey does, right? So the type of clothing, the interview location, and interview props. So one of the things that's important is that the participant and the researcher feel comfortable, right? So this would require a researcher dressing reasonably professional and selecting a location where there is a guarantee that you can still maintain confidentiality and privacy. And this is, again, relates to the kinds of topics that you're selecting. So you want to be able to have a place where the participant feels safe, they feel comfortable, they feel free to speak openly and share personal information, but also that their anonymity is going to be protected, right? So it's not like you're in a busy, crowded mall and that at any given moment someone could walk by who they know, right? Or overhear them speaking, right? But also, and then so the last thing I want to mention is interview props. So this would be if you are using something to help stimulate conversation. So this could be anything from images to reading a short vignette, which would include a scenario or a hypothetical story, something along that nature. Are you going to ask participants to draw things, to react or respond to different visual stimulus like pictures or news stories or statements? And so the choice of all of those things can really change the quality of the interview and are all important considerations to take that we don't see in the other research methods, especially the quantitative research methods. All right, so I'm going to be reviewing the participant observation method, which is part of a broader methodological approach of social observation. So as I mentioned earlier, the researcher who is selecting a participant observation, and this is typically associated with ethnography and the discipline of anthropology and sociology utilize this a lot. Psychology, it's pretty rare, as well as in economics, and political science will also sometimes utilize this research method. And so this could include anything from working into a company to living in a particular village or community that you want to really learn a lot about, right? So this is a type of method where you're going to go beyond survey questions, you're going to go beyond even interview questions, because you're going to be having these continued and sustained interactions with the people in that particular research site. So participant observation is really interested in learning more about the meanings that people in a particular place or the research site give to their behavior. And so the way to do this is to observe their actual actions, right, as opposed to just ask them questions about their behavior, right? And this applies to whatever the field site is. So when a researcher is able to successfully interpret these meanings and experiences that individuals have in a particular research site, the argument for and the rationale for using participant observation is that this is something that you can't obtain through survey research or the interview method, right? And so researchers who utilize participant observation are interested in getting as close to their participants' reality, right? Now, all research methods have a set of challenges and limitations. We talked about the challenges and limitations to the survey method the last few weeks, and this method is no exception. So some of the challenges to this research method is that all participant observation is incredibly time consuming, right? So especially thinking about the method of ethnography, this method, a researcher is typically at bare minimum going to spend 6 months at their research site, and usually it's longer. So I would say probably a year to a year and a half is kind of the typical range that a participant would spend at their research site. So clearly, you can see how this is time consuming, right? So this is not a research method that lends itself to a lot of people in the social sciences, right? So if you have young children, if you need to work in addition to being a graduate student, if you have people in your family who you are a caregiver for, right? This is not going to be a type of research method that you're going to be able to pursue, even if it is perhaps the most appropriate method or even the one that you're most interested in, right? So that's a very real challenge and limitation to not just the method, but who is actually able in the social sciences to pursue this research method. In terms of when we get to kind of more the results and the findings of research that utilizes a participant observation method, because this is difficult to replicate, if not impossible, right? Because even if you went to the same research site, you went to the same neighborhood, you went to the same school, you went to the same company and conducted a participant observation, trying to replicate the findings of another researcher, because it's so time consuming and because things could, drastically shift, it's a really difficult type of research method to replicate, right? When we're thinking of kind of the standards of quality research, right? So it doesn't mean that it's impossible or that what we can learn from participant observation is not good or helpful. It's just different than a survey, right? Where you can easily replicate it, ask the same exact questions without much difficulty at all. The other thing is that when we think about generalizing findings to a population, this is typically not something that is a strength of participant observation, right? It's worth noting, though, that researchers who select this method are typically not interested in generalizing to the entire population. They're usually just interested in focusing on the particular site that they select, right? Whether it be a company, a classroom, or even a particular community, right? The last thing I wanted to bring up in terms of a challenge to this method is that this method is a lot more susceptible to ethical issues when it comes to having an ethical balance of power and authority, because typically the researcher has no oversight and is conducting their research without colleagues nearby, or maybe even any kind of sustained interaction with their colleagues, whether it be a faculty advisor, other graduate students, other faculty, the IRB board, etc. And so that's definitely something that researchers who select this method need to consider.